The Arizona sun was a living thing, a merciless predator crouched overhead, its heat pressing down like an invisible weight on Richard Sullivan's shoulders. He could feel it gnawing at him, blistering his already scorched skin, searing through the thin remnants of his once impeccable suit. The jacket had long since been ripped away, the crisp white shirt now yellowed with sweat, streaked with dust, and clinging to him like a second skin. His wrists burned where coarse rope cut deep, binding him to the ridged trunk of a massive saguaro cactus. Each time he shifted, sharp spines dug into his back, sending fresh spikes of pain through his body. He tried to lick his lips, but they had cracked hours ago, splitting painfully beneath the attempt. His tongue was thick and dry, scraping like sandpaper against the roof of his mouth. Time had dissolved into a blur, minutes, hours, a whole day. He couldn't tell anymore. The world had narrowed to heat, thirst, and the slow, creeping fog of dehydration. And through it all, the question pulsed like a drumbeat. Who did this to me? There were hints, fragments of memory that floated to the surface of his scorched mind. The echo of footsteps in a parking garage, a sudden movement in the shadows, a cloth pressed violently over his face, its chemical steam biting into his nostrils before darkness swallowed him whole. And just before losing consciousness, a voice, low, rough, and brimming with contempt, whispering against his ear, "You deserve to know what it feels like to lose everything." Richard Sullivan knew the voice didn't come from a stranger. It came from someone who knew his name, someone who had a score to settle. He let his head loll against the cactus, squeezing his eyes shut against the glare. But shutting them only opened the door to memories. Memories of himself seated at the head of a gleaming mahogany table, the boardroom air sharp with tension. He could see Frank Williams' face, flushed and furious, jabbing a finger toward the blueprints for Desert Springs Resort. "You can't just bulldoze 40 families out of their homes, Sullivan." Richard had leaned back, cool and unmoved, adjusting the gold cufflinks at his wrists. "The law is on my side, Mr. Williams. Your little community is sitting on prime real estate, and I've jumped through every legal hoop. You have 48 hours to vacate. After that, it's trespassing." That was who he was, brilliant, relentless, and detached. Profit over people, progress over compassion. And now, tied to a cactus in the middle of nowhere, with no water and no shade, he was getting the taste of what it meant to be powerless. Still, he refused to call it regret. Not yet. Regret was for the weak, but there was something flickering in the back of his mind, small, unfamiliar, unwelcome. It wasn't quite fear, and it wasn't guilt, but it was close enough to both to make him uneasy. The heat shimmered in the air before him, distorting the horizon, making the desert dance and writhe. He blinked, certain that the wavering shapes forming there were just another cruel trick of his failing mind. But as the seconds stretched, the shapes sharpened. They were moving. 3 figures, small, unhurried, stepping across the cracked earth with a kind of wary purpose. He narrowed his eyes. They were too small to be adults, but they weren't lost. Their strides were steady, their direction sure. As they drew closer, the desert mirage gave way to the startling truth. 3 boys, identical in height, build, and sun-browned skin. 3 pairs of solemn eyes locked on him from beneath warm baseball caps the desert wind carried. The sound of their footfalls, and Richard Sullivan, for the first time in a very long while, had no idea what was about to happen next. The heat clung to him like an invisible shroud. But now Richard's focus had shifted from his own misery to the 3 small figures drawing nearer. They stopped a few yards away, their shadows long and thin on the sand, staring at him with a kind of stillness that felt deliberate. It was the stillness of creatures who had learned to survive by watching first, moving later. The one in the middle stepped slightly forward. His eyes were steady, too steady for a child. "Are you the man they brought here last night?" His voice carried just enough to be heard over the wind, flat and calm, as if he already knew the answer. Richard's throat burned, his voice cracking into a hoarse rasp. "Yes, water. Please." The word please tasted strange on his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he'd used it. The boy on the right, smaller by a hair, but otherwise identical, lifted a battered plastic water bottle. Richard heard the liquid slosh inside, and for a moment it was all he could look at. He imagined its weight in his hand, the cold splash against his lips, the relief flooding down his throat. But the boy didn't come closer. "We were told not to untie you," the one on the left said quietly. "Said it wasn't our business." His tone wasn't cruel. It was almost apologetic, but the words hit Richard like another lash. The son, the middle boy, glanced at his brothers, then back at Richard. Nobody said we couldn't give you water. He walked forward, slow, like approaching a wild animal. Our mom always said everyone deserves kindness, even if they don't deserve it. Richard's cracked lips parted, but no words came. Not because of the dryness in his mouth, but because something in that statement, in the easy way the boy said it, went straight through the armor he'd worn his whole life. Up close, their sameness was startling. 3 pairs of solemn, brown eyes, 3 faces cut from the same mold, but each marked by something distinct. A line of tension around one's mouth, a spark of curiosity in another's gaze, a softness in the third. "I'm Jack," said the one with the natural air of command, the one who had spoken first. "This is Jason." He nodded toward the boy with the water bottle. "And that's Joshua." Jason's knuckles widened around the bottle as if weighing whether to hand it over. Joshua, the one with the gentle eyes, solved the dilemma by stepping in, unscrewing the cap, and holding it to Richard's mouth himself. The first drops were a shock, almost painful against his parched throat, but then came the flood of life. Sharp, clean, glorious, more. Richard gasped, but Jack put a hand on Joshua's arm. "Not too much at once. He's been out here all night." There was authority in his voice, the kind that didn't come from age or title, but from necessity. Richard recognized it instantly. It was the voice of someone used to making decisions others depended on. He studied them, the frayed cuffs of their shirts, the way the desert dust clung to their skin. "How do you live out here?" he managed, his voice still a rasp. Jason's jaw tightened. "We have a cabin, about a mile away. It's not much, but it's home." "Where are your parents?" The smallest shadow of pain crossed all 3 faces at once. "Our mom died 2 years ago," Jack said flatly. "Never knew our dad." Joshua shifted the bottle in his hands. "We do our jobs in town. Mrs. Betty at the market gives us day-old bread. We know which plants we can eat. Mom taught us before." His voice trailed off. The desert wind stirred, carrying the faint sound of something metallic clinking in the distance. Richard's pulse ticked up. Whoever had left him here might still be close. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, searching their faces. They glanced at each other, silent communication passing between them. Finally Joshua answered, "Because you look thirsty." "And scared," Jason added, as if it needed to be said. Jack's gaze didn't waver. "And because our mom told us to help people who need it." Richard's mind reeled. In a place where survival meant guarding every scrap of food and drop of water, these boys were choosing to share. And not just with anyone, with a stranger tied to a cactus. A man whose presence in their lives could mean nothing but trouble. The sound in the distance grew clearer, the low growl of an approaching engine. All 3 boys turned toward it in unison, their bodies stiffening, their eyes narrowing. "Time to go," Jack said sharply. Jason capped the bottle. Joshua stepped back, and in moments they were melting into the desert again, quick and silent. Richard's heart pounded. They had appeared like a mirage, given him life in the form of water, and vanished again into the emptiness. The engine's rumble deepened. Dust rose on the horizon, and Richard knew whatever was coming next. The boys had just given him something worth fighting to survive for. Ass checked. The engine's growl swelled until it filled the air, vibrating through the cactus at Richard's back. The heat shimmer blurred the horizon, but the dust plume that followed told him this was no illusion. Someone was coming. Straight toward him. Every instinct told him to brace for trouble. Whoever had dumped him here wasn't finished yet. The triplet's sudden disappearance made that clear enough. They knew the land, knew danger when they heard it, and they'd melted into it like smoke. A battered pickup truck came into view, its paint sun-bleached to a dull ghost of red, its grill scarred from years of hard work. It slowed as it neared, tires crunching over the cracked earth, until it rolled to a stop a few yards away. 3 men stepped out. The first was tall, his face carved by years of wind and sun, his eyes set deep beneath a furrowed brow. He moved with the kind of controlled energy that made you think of coiled wire, taut, waiting to snap. The second man was broad-shouldered, with a beard that couldn't quite hide the tension in his jaw. The third was lean, his clothes worn but clean, his eyes shifting constantly, scanning for threats. The tall one stopped just out of arm's reach. "Sullivan," he said, his voice like gravel under a boot. It wasn't a question. Richard swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "Who are you?" You don't remember me. The man's mouth twitched into something between a sneer and a grimace. Frank Williams, we met. Boardroom in Phoenix. You had a fountain put where my house used to be. Memories slammed into Richard, the shouting, the demands, the blueprints spread across the table. Frank's face, red with anger, the day Richard had signed the order that would bulldoze his neighborhood. You left us with nothing. Frank said, stepping closer, his boots grinding the sand. Thought maybe you should find out what that feels like. The bearded man crossed his arms. We weren't gonna hurt you. Just let the dessert make a point. Richard's mind flicked back to the boys. Jack's sharp voice, Joshua's quiet kindness, Jason's watchful eyes. They're connected to this. He realized they have to. B.E. You know 3 kids. He said slowly, about 10 years old. Triplets. Frank's eyes narrowed. Sarah's boys. He jerked his chin at the lean man, who nodded grimly. They came out here. They gave me water. For a moment, something flickered in Frank's expression, surprise, maybe even respect. They've got more decency than most grown men I've met, he muttered. The broad-shouldered man stepped forward, his voice low but tight. Sarah died because of you. No home, no insurance, no way to get care when she got sick. You don't get to walk away from that clean. The heat, the ropes, the cactus spines. Richard barely felt them anymore. The words were worse. He'd heard 100 accusations in his life, all from people he could afford to ignore. But this landed differently. These weren't abstract residents or numbers on a ledger. They were faces, names, and now children. He'd met. I can't undo it, Richard said quietly, but I can make it right. Frank barked a humorless laugh. Make it right? With what? A check. That's always your answer. Richard shook his head. With change. His voice was steadier now. Not charity, change. The men exchanged glances, suspicion, disbelief, but also hesitation. Then, faint but clear, came the sound of small feet against sand. The triplets emerged from behind a stand of mesquite, moving like shadows into the open. They came to stand between the men and Richard, not speaking, just there. Joshua glanced up at Frank. He means it. The boy's voice was soft, but it carried something weightier than volume, conviction. Frank studied him, then Richard, then the other boys. What's your plan, Sullivan? He asked finally. Richard met his gaze without blinking. Untie me, and I'll show you. The silence stretched, the sun burned, and then Frank gave a sharp nod. The ropes fell away. Blood surged back into Richard's numb hands, pins and needles stabbing through his fingers. He didn't move right away, just sat there in the dust, looking up at the 3 men and the 3 boys. I'll start tomorrow, he said. No one spoke. The wind stirred, and far off, the horizon shimmered like a promise still out of reach. Asked Jack. Frank's pickup rumbled across the cracked earth, its suspension groaning under years of hard miles. Richard sat in the passenger seat, his body still aching from the cactus's cruel embrace. Every bump jolted his ribs, but it was nothing compared to the jolt rattling around in his head. He had been in 1,000 luxury vehicles, cocooned in climate control and stitched leather. Now he sat in a truck with a cracked windshield, the smell of dust and gasoline hanging heavy in the cab, and the eyes of Frank Williams flicking toward him every few seconds like a man still deciding whether he'd made a mistake cutting him loose. The triplets rode in the truck bed, knees pulled up, eyes scanning the desert like watchful hawks. They didn't speak, didn't joke, didn't fidget. Richard couldn't decide if that discipline was learned or simply baked into their bones from surviving out here. They reached the edge of Copper Creek just as the sky shifted from molten gold to the cooler tones of evening. The town was small, a single main street lined with weather-worn businesses, neon signs that flickered in half-light, and a handful of locals leaning against storefronts, arms crossed as they watched the truck roll in. Frank parked in front of a squat building with a faded sign, Betty's Market. She's not gonna like this, Frank muttered as he cut the engine. The door swung open before Richard could step out. Betty herself filled the frame, a stout woman in her 60s, her hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes as sharp as dessert glass. She took one look at Richard and stiffened, her voice slicing through the quiet street. What in God's name is he doing here? The triplets hopped down from the truck bed, moving to stand between Betty and Richard. Jack spoke first, his tone formal, but firm. He's here to help us. Betty's gaze softened a fraction as she looked at the boys, but when it returned to Richard, it was Flint again. This man destroyed your community. He's the reason your mother. She stopped herself, her jaw tightening. I know, Richard said quietly, and nothing I do will make that right. But I'm here to try. Betty studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside with a reluctant wave of her hand. Fine, but you'll speak where I can hear every word. Inside, the market smelled of old wood, coffee, and something warm baking in the back. Richard followed Betty to a small office behind the counter, the triplets slipping in after him. Frank leaned against the doorway, arms folded like a guard who wasn't sure yet which way things would go. Richard laid it out. Not vague promises, but specifics. A housing restoration fund for every displaced family, a community clinic, school funding, Winter's Crossing, a development built not to erase the past, but to honor it. And at the center of it all, the triplets, whose education and future he would personally safeguard. Betty didn't interrupt. She didn't nod. She didn't even blink much. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Money fixes roofs, Sullivan. It doesn't fix people. You willing to do both?" Richard met her eyes. Yes. The silence that followed was thick. The kind that feels like the room itself is measuring your worth. Finally, Betty looked at the boys. "What do you think?" Joshua spoke, his voice carrying more weight than his years. "I think he's telling the truth." It was enough. Betty sighed, shook her head, and stood. "All right, we start tomorrow. But if you walk away from this, Sullivan, I'll make sure everyone knows you're still the same man you were before." Frank's smirk was brief, almost approving, as they stepped back into the cooling night. The triplets walked ahead, their matching silhouettes cutting across the amber streetlight. Richard felt the eyes of Copper Creek on him, wary, measuring. Somewhere inside, a decision had already settled. He wouldn't just make good on his word. He'd burn every bridge back to the man he used to be, but he didn't notice, not until later. The figure leaning in the alley across from Betty's market, watching, waiting, and smiling like he already knew that redemption never comes without a cost. The next morning, the desert sky was painted in pale pink and gold when Richard pulled up outside Betty's market in a borrowed station wagon. The resort-polished Mercedes stayed locked in his Scottsdale garage. The thought of driving it here felt obscene. He'd slept little, his mind running over every promise he'd made. Everywhere he glanced from the night before, the triplets were already waiting, lined up on the curb in their mismatched clothes, their hair still damp from hurried washing. Jack stood the straightest, his expression unreadable. Jason clutched a beat-up notebook like it was a shield. Joshua's eyes, ever watchful, darted between Richard and the empty street as if expecting trouble to appear from it. "Morning," Richard said, forcing a warmth he wasn't sure he owned yet. "Morning," Jack replied, and the three climbed into the back. No hesitation, no chatter, just quiet trust, or maybe cautious curiosity. The first stop was Copper Creek Elementary, a squat building with peeling paint, but an air of stubborn pride inside. The principal, Mrs. Ramirez, greeted them with a handshake that lingered just long enough to remind Richard she knew exactly who he was. He signed enrollment forms, handed over a prewritten check to cover supplies, lunches, and uniforms, and quietly arranged a direct line of contact should the boys need anything. "Testing says they're well above grade level in several subjects," Mrs. Ramirez said. "Considering their situation, it's remarkable." Richard glanced at the boys. Jack's jaw tightened. Jason stared at the floor. Joshua smiled faintly as if the compliment wasn't new, but still mattered. When they stepped back outside, the sun was higher, burning away the cool edges of morning. Richard's phone buzzed. "Margaret," he answered. "Where are you?" Her voice was sharp, the kind that expected answers immediately. "With the boys," he said. A pause. "Richard, the board meets in an hour. The CFO says your plan has shareholders calling in a panic. We're hemorrhaging value. I'll be there," he said, and ended the call before she could respond. Back in Phoenix, the boardroom felt smaller than he remembered, the air heavy with perfume, cologne, and the scent of fear masked his arrogance. Hawkins, the CFO, wasted no time. "This project is corporate suicide. The optics," Richard interrupted, "are exactly why we're doing this. We've spent decades profiting from displacement. Now we'll profit by rebuilding. But this time, the people come first." Murmurs, disbelief. Someone muttered about idealism like it was a disease. He stood, looking each of them in the eye. I'm not asking for permission. I still control the majority. The decision is made. When he returned to Copper Creek that evening, the triplets were waiting on the diner's front steps, their new uniforms and bags at their feet. Joshua was the first to speak. Mrs. Betty says you stood up to your board today. Richard tilted his head. News travels fast. Here, faster than you think, Jack said, almost smiling. They sat at the counter, eating burgers and fries, the boys talking more freely now, about school starting Monday, about a patch of land behind their cabin where their mother once grew. Sunflowers. Jason's eyes lit when he spoke of rebuilding it, for the first time in years. Richard felt anchored, not to a project, not to a profit margin, but to something alive, unpredictable, and stubbornly good. He didn't see the shadow. Through the diner's front window, a man leaning against a truck across the street, watching, the same one from the alley the night before. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and didn't look away. Richard would only learn later that not everyone in Copper Creek wanted Winter's Crossing to succeed, and that the next move against him wouldn't come from his past in Phoenix, but from far closer. By the time the first concrete slab was poured for Winter's Crossing, the desert air was thick with the smell of dust and diesel. The skeletal frames of new homes began to rise from the barren ground like cautious promises, and for the first time in months, the people of Copper Creek walked past the construction site with something other than suspicion. In their eyes, Richard had thrown himself into the work. He came down from Phoenix nearly every day, wearing boots instead of loafers, a hard hat instead of a boardroom smirk. He signed off on materials personally, argued with contractors about safety, and met every family whose name was on the housing list. The triplets shadowed him often, learning how to read blueprints, asking questions about wiring, plumbing, and even landscaping. Jack absorbed leadership lessons without realizing it. Jason focused on the technical details like a sponge, and Joshua moved between workers and residents with the ease of someone born to connect people. Margaret came down to, reluctantly at first, but now with a planner tucked under her arm and reading glasses perched on her nose. She organized food drives, negotiated with suppliers, and kept meticulous records of donations and expenses. The locals were still wary, but they were beginning to see her as more than a polished stranger. And yet, under the hum of progress, Richard felt a subtle wrongness. It was in the way. Some construction supplies went missing from the site, nothing large enough to stall the work, but enough to be deliberate. It was in the unexplained graffiti that appeared one morning on the frame of a nearly finished home. Not everyone wants this. It was in the figure he kept catching at the edge of his vision, a man in a sun-bleached cap. Always gone before Richard could get close. The triplets noticed it too. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, Jason came to him quietly. That man was watching again, by the fence near the water tanks. Same one? Richard asked. Jason nodded. Same one. Richard knew better than to dismiss it. Change didn't just build homes. It rattled cages. There were people in Copper Creek who'd adapted to the old ways, who saw the new development as a threat to whatever control or comfort they'd carved out in the shadows. That night, Richard stayed later than usual at the site, walking the rows of half-built houses alone. The desert was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something. He was checking the locks on the tool shed when he heard it, the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate. He turned, but the darkness beyond the portable floodlights was thick, swallowing everything. You think you're saving this place, a voice said from somewhere inside the black, low, unfamiliar. But you're just making it weaker. Some people need to remember who they owe. Richard took a step toward the sound. If you have a problem, step into the light. Silence, then the faint hiss of a match striking. For an instant, the flare lit up a face, sun-hardened, eyes sharp with something between hatred and warning, before it was gone again. The match went out, the footsteps retreated, and the desert swallowed the man whole. The next morning, the triplets arrived early. Jack's expression was tight. Joshua's hands were clenched. We think we know who it is, Jack said, and if we're right, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Richard glanced at the busy construction site, the families counting on him, the fragile trust that had taken so long to build. He'd come to Copper Creek to make amends, but it was becoming clear that redemption wouldn't be handed to him. Someone was going to test just how far he was willing to go to protect this place and these boys, and Richard Sullivan was finally ready to be tested. The night of the community's first official gathering at the half-finished Winter's Crossing Square was supposed to be a celebration, a way to show Copper Creek that the project wasn't just a dream, but a living thing. Strings of bare bulbs hung between the frames of unfinished homes, casting warm light on the dusty ground. Tables groaned under the weight of donated food. Kids darted through the crowd, their laughter echoing off the skeletal walls. Richard stood near the center, speaking with Betty and the town council. When he felt it, that prickle between the shoulder blades, the sensation of being watched. His eyes swept the crowd, and there he was, the man from the shadows, same sun-bleached cap, same stillness, leaning against a post at the edge of the light. Jack noticed him too. The boy moved closer to Richard, his voice low. That's him. The man didn't approach, didn't join the festivities, just watched. His gaze wasn't curiosity, it was ownership, as if daring Richard to acknowledge him. The speeches began. Richard took the small plywood stage, the triplets standing just behind him, Margaret in the front row. He spoke about the progress they'd made, the homes nearly ready for families to move into, the clinic set to open before year's end. But halfway through, his eyes found the man again. At this time, the man smiled. It wasn't friendly. After the applause, the man slipped into the darkness. Richard excused himself and followed. He caught up with him near the far end of the construction site, where the portable lights thinned and the dessert began to reclaim the space. You've been hanging around for weeks, Richard said. Why? The man turned slowly, the lines in his face deepened by the shadows. Because this isn't yours to fix. Richard kept his voice steady. It's everyone's to fix. It's their homes, their lives, it's their debt. The man cut in sharply. And debt keeps people in line. You give them houses, healthcare, jobs. You think they'll remember who they answer to when the hard times come again? You mean they'll stop answering to you? Richard said, understanding dawning. The man stepped closer, the smell of cigarettes and dust clinging to him. There's order in this town, Sullivan. An order you're breaking. That order buried Sarah Winters. Richard shot back, his anger rising. It left kids in the desert to fend for themselves. If you think I'm walking away because you're afraid of losing control, you don't know me at all. The man smiled thin. We'll see. He brushed past Richard and was gone, swallowed by the dark. Richard returned to the square, the music and laughter pulling at the edges of his tension. The triplets were waiting, eyes searching his face. He's not going to stop, Jack said quietly. No. Richard agreed, but neither are we. In the weeks that followed, the threats became bolder. Tools vanished overnight. Tires were slashed on the delivery trucks. Once, someone left a dead rattlesnake on the steps of the unfinished clinic. The message was clear, leave, but each time, Richard doubled down. More security lights went up. Extra hands volunteered from the community. Even Margaret, once so eager to keep her distance, confronted suppliers face to face when delays threatened the schedule. And then came the final attempt to break them. One night, a fire broke out in one of the newly finished houses. By the time Richard and Frank arrived, flames were chewing through the walls, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and insulation. But the triplets were already there, hauling buckets in a frantic chain with other residents, their faces streaked with soot, refusing to let the work die. They saved most of the structure. The next morning, standing in the blackened shell, Richard called an all-hands meeting. This was no accident, he said, his voice carrying, and it won't be the thing that stops us. We rebuild, stronger, together. When Winter's Crossing finally opened, it wasn't just a ribbon cutting, it was a declaration of survival. The man in the cap didn't show his face again. Maybe he'd left. Maybe he'd simply lost the hold he thought he had. But his shadow lingered as a reminder. Redemption wasn't about winning once. It was about holding the line every single day. At the dedication ceremony, the triplets stood before the crowd. Joshua's voice trembled only slightly as he said, our mom used to tell us that kindness is strongest when it's tested. We've all been tested, and we're still here. The applause was thunderous, but Richard barely heard it. His gaze went to the horizon, where the desert met the sky. There had been a time, not long ago, when that place had been his prison. Now, it was the boundary of something he'd helped build, not just homes, but a community strong enough to stand against whatever came for it. And in that moment, he understood the triplets hadn't just changed his life, they had given it back to him, piece by piece, until there was no part of him that belonged to the man he used to be.